Hello, okay, we're streaming. Sorry about that. I'm trying to work out how to get this first trial run at my home office working, so I wasn't quite sure that the stream was happening. Okay, so I don't really have any way of testing out the audio quality. I'm worried it might be a little bit echoey in here, but hopefully you guys can hear me. The last time I tried this was a bit off the cuff, but it was in my home office. It was in my office, and now I'm at home, so it might be a little trickier to hear me. But I hopefully have solved a couple of the other issues that people mentioned. So I've bumped the font size up in my editor, and I'm hopefully going to move the things over to the left so that the little video screen of me isn't covering things, and also hopefully rather than fixing a bug or something without any context, I'm just going to show you what I'm planning on working on and how we achieve something. So massive thank you to everyone who responded to the first one of these that I did. It was really, like I said, off the cuff, so I wasn't really sure whether people would find value, but I totally understood what people said. Sometimes just seeing how other people, even literally just their laptop setup, is sometimes kind of fascinating. So the next conversation I had was about multi-step forms, and it was on this Reddit thread in here somewhere. So this conversation was about multi-step forms. So Rails Programmer 94. Multi-step forms have been the bane of my existence, and my attempt to use form objects to implement them was a dismal failure. So that was after my suggestion of using form objects to solve an issue that they were having with basically needing to do two things on one single step, while as I understood the question, the user was going through this multi-step process. And I've seen that approached a bunch of different ways. And first I would say, like, this is not a tutorial. Like, I'm not showing you how to do these things. I have no that's not what I do, but I can show you how I've approached it, and a couple of other places that I've looked for those references and where I've taken the references from. So if any of this is interesting or useful, I would really appreciate people's feedback on how I've done it. And again, it might be completely insane to other people, and vice versa. So any feedback there would be really interesting. And if people want to show how they've approached the same subject. So there are a couple of kind of known quantities that I was aware of when I first started. So the first way that I looked at handling multi-step forms was the Wicked gem, which is basically a gem that adds a bunch of helpers to controllers. And I think it actually says somewhere in here somewhere, it says like, we as a gem add a bunch of stuff to this. I'm going through this really quickly. It adds a bunch of stuff, I think, to application controller, and I think it says something, I'm not sure, like about yeah, so it pretty much seems to add a bunch of additional methods that to application control that you can then use, and you define a set of steps, and then it provides you helpers to move back and forward through those, and you include the Wicked module in your controllers as you go through. That was where I first started, and I did try using the gem. I didn't. It was a little bit. It would often hide or kind of abstract away the things that I wanted to know about where I was in the wizard and things like that. But it was a great solution for what it did. The thing that really interested me was this RailsConf talk from 2014, and I'll put a link to this in the Reddit thread. But this is Ultralight and Maintainable Wizards by Andy. I have no idea. Malay? No, sorry if I've just butchered your surname. So he runs through, it's actually 28 minutes into the talk, this little screenshot I've grabbed. He talks about how other approaches to this problem So 1001 wizard implementations, one controller per wizard step. And he kind of looks at what he does and doesn't like about them. And I think that was where I started to see, he just really handily put them all together in one place, and runs through the pros and cons of what works and doesn't work. The other implementation that I see of this most often is to then take it out into JavaScript and make API calls, or however you're doing it, or just if you're using something like React or Redux to hold all of the state of your whole process, or maybe your whole app in there. That's not something that I have a huge amount of expertise in. That's not the kind of apps that I run. So the solution that I'm always looking to improve is kind of things on the Rails side, keeping things in that kind of model view controller kind of framework. But we do use React components in the multi-step processes in the wizards that I use, but they are kind of constrained to one individual step. It's not a full component handling the entire process. But hopefully the way that I have structured them, I'm kind of hoping that it would lend itself well to then being transposed out to a React component that could then call each individual step as an API call, or however you wanted to do it. So those are some of the resources that I've used. I've also taken a look at a few other implementations of this. So I'm really interested if anyone has got any other examples or kind of has any other thoughts on this. So this tends to be how I approach this, is which kind of one controller per wizard step, sort of. So So in the app that I work on, which is Echoleft, which is the app I was using in my first live stream, we use this pattern quite a lot of having one controller per wizard step. And we call them setups. So basically, because of this, step one is where you actually set up the active record or the model that you're working on. And we tend to use them as you create the model that you're working on. So the example I'm going to give you, show you what I'm working on in the next few days, is of a donation model. So we use the donations controller to set up the donation as our model. And then we kind of set up that instance of the model. So you basically create your donation, but the donation you create is basically pretty blank. And then what you're doing is moving through that setup process to get it to the point where you can do whatever you want to it. So for us, it's to complete the donation, to take that final financial transaction and complete it. So we call them setups rather than wizards or anything like that, just because that's our most common implementation of them. But obviously that wording doesn't work well for other implementations. So if I show you kind of how that works on ours, so this is my development environment, so I actually don't know if I have, so if I try this out. So this would be our donations controller. Just put some gibberish here. £10. I'm going to continue to the next step. I don't think this will work, so it might. It's going to ask me to create a password. It's going to want me to confirm my email address, but let's see if that works. Yeah, cool. Okay, so now I'm actually in the setup. So you can see now that my resource actually has an ID 15606. So I've moved from the donations controller to our donations setup controllers, and there's a series of controllers. And so I have one to collect the address, one to collect the payment details, and then one to review and confirm. So at the moment, there's a pretty basic process. And the payment details uses a React component to interact with Stripe and handle all of the actual card details and things like that. But between each step, you do actually go back to the server and back to a controller. So that's how we do it. So if I take a look at the editor, I'm just kind of hopefully checking that you guys can actually see this. See if the font size is big enough. So I've made the font size on this a little bigger. So hopefully I can, sorry, I keep looking to my right, it's where I have this live stream up. So hopefully you can read this. I only have one monitor here at home today, so everything's got to be on this screen. So we have our donations controller, and when we create the donation, it just gets created. And as you saw in that demo I just gave, when it was first created, it didn't have a user attached. So we basically let you create it, and then we send you off to go and choose a password. That is, we call it create and claim. So basically you have to create your user account, and then we send you back to the donation you just made where you claim it. So we store the email address that you enter, and then when the user with that email address comes back, we claim it as yours. And so you obviously have to verify. You saw there was an email you get, so you have to verify your email address. So just this kind of standard email-based verification, and then you kind of move through the next set of steps. So when you create the donation, you don't actually have to have a user account for that. And this is our donations setup base controller. So in the example from the talk from 2014, you can see that this is kind of what we do, only we don't have step 1 control, step 2. We have a base controller that controls all of these. So that is here. And we do the same thing that Wicked does, which is where we define, so here they're just defining the set of steps. And we do the same thing in our base controller. So we define our set of steps here just as an array. And then we also provide in this, we have like a little module here, steppable. And so you can see steps, you can do next step, previous step, current step with offset. So you can kind of jump between them. And these are kind of helpers that each individual controller can use. And so the thing that most of them use is the path for next step. So we pass the path for the next step through. So what I'm really aware of is how deliberately simplistic this pattern is. So if you're really doing complicated things where you're having to make 5 different calls for, like the example in the Reddit thread was for like pricing queries and things like that, this is probably too simplistic for that, but we can design that way so that people just really, they don't have a lot of options. There isn't a lot of forking paths in the flow. They have to move through it in the order that they're given. And they can go back sometimes, but we don't really want them to do that. We kind of want them to move through and keep going. And then at the end, we offer them edit buttons that jump them back to that step, and then they can move forward back through it. So that's how we provide a set of reusable methods to each individual step. So then we actually have the steps themselves. So we then name account verifications, personal details, payments, and confirmations. So you'll then see that we have over here like the personal details. So these are namespaced. So you can see their donation setup, personal details controller. And you can kind of see it's really basic things. We're only asking for a few bits of information on each controller. We just, when you come through, we claim if it's unclaimed. That I think now is handled on the previous controller, which is that create and claim kind of mechanism that I was speaking about before. And literally, if we just save the donation, that's that bang. I don't think that bang should be there. To check the test for that. So we literally just save the donation because we're only ever working on a single individual resource. But in the Reddit thread I mentioned earlier, there was this conversation. I have used form objects on these before. If we are doing something more complicated, I have had success elsewhere using form objects. If you are saving 3 or 4 things, but using the form object on an individual step of the process, rather than trying to create one form object that represents the entire flow, if that makes sense. So again, it's keeping that design simplistic. One of the biggest issues we faced with this in production, so we use this pattern a lot, and it seems to work okay. So was the back button in Safari, especially mobile Safari, where this became worse when we started mingling in JavaScript as well, which was when they hit the back button, the user would see the state of the page no matter what had happened. So mobile Safari, especially when the user hit the back button, would just show them what they had just seen, no matter no matter what had changed in the meantime, even if they had gone 3 steps forward and changed a bunch of data and hit the edit button and things like that. When they went back, they'd see it in the same way. So we added in a cache buffer, which is not ideal, obviously, because we want the caching that we get, but because we try and keep the response times of each individual steps quick enough that this seems to be worth the trade-off, although I think that if this became a performance issue or we got that kind of feedback, then we would look to do, I don't know, fragment caching or something like that. Again, be really interested to see how people deal with that. The back button in multi-step flows, I find that has not been great. Even on JavaScript-enabled ones where maybe it's a single-page app, but if you hit the back button and you're jumping 3 steps up, things tend to be able to go a little bit haywire. So if anyone has any good tips for dealing with that, maybe just busting the cache is not a great solution. I don't know. So then they move through. You'll see a payments controller in this step. So you see it actually does nothing because that step is controlled by just a React component on there. So all they're doing is pinging a different API to do with Stripe and payments. So that is actually just a placeholder, and there's just a button on that view they can hit. So that is, I mean, that's basically it. It's a really simple design that's worked for us, and we use it in a bunch of different places. We have changed it over time. We, I think, didn't used to do the claim and create. We used to try and let you. I think we used to force you to have a user account before you set it up before. I think that was our first version. And then we had a few, kind of made a few changes along the way, but this is probably the simplest version. So that kind of brings me on to the second thing that I was hoping to kind of demo to people, which is the changes that I'm going to be working on. So again, if people would be interested in seeing how these get implemented, and again, seeing how other people work. This is what's there at the moment, and we want to make some changes. So we have 2 new features coming up, and they are the ability to make recurring donations rather than making a single one-off donation, and also improvements to gift aid. So for those that aren't based in the UK, gift aid is a process where if you donate to a registered UK charity, the UK government will supplement the donation of a UK taxpayer, so to the tune of 25%. So if you make a declaration that you are an eligible taxpayer, you say, I'm going to give, say, £10 to charity, you make your gift aid declaration, the charity then take that declaration to HMRC, which is our Inland Revenue, our tax organisation, and they will send the charity another £2.50. So they'll say, okay, yep, cool, that all checks out. Here's £2.50. So it's the charity gets the original £10, and then they can claim the gift aid on the donation. But they have to have the gift aid eligibility information, and the donor themselves is responsible for the validity of that declaration. So you say, I am a UK taxpayer, these are my details. The charity passes that on, and it's the taxpayer themselves who's like, yeah, I'm declaring that the government should give them £2.50. And we are improving that process because the process is slightly different for recurring donations. So there's a mechanism where online platforms like ours can claim a gift aid declaration and then use it over a period of time within a tax year. So that's completely very specific to our implementation, but we want to make some changes to our platform to get ready for that. So I just wanted to show kind of what that looked like. So people were interested in how other people work. So I work on this, it's mainly me doing this stuff, so there are other people involved, but it'll be me kind of doing most of the work and implementing it. So a lot of our work starts in a sketch like this. So I tend to design our layouts as mobile first. So you can see that each of these is basically an iPhone mobile screen, and this is an end-to-end process. This actually is not perfectly aligned. It's not like a user story design, because it actually has things from 2 or 3 other features that are in the pipeline. So there's things like down in this screen here, we have things like communication preferences. That's actually a separate feature that isn't due to go live, but it's in here already. There's a couple of other things in here, so the different terms and conditions layouts, like that step won't be in there. So I tend to design for the longer haul, for what's about to go live, and then go through, show this to people. This is Sketch. They have a Sketch Cloud feature which allows you to put these things in the online. So I mean, there's a URL there. You can. There's nothing personally identifiable in here. It's all dummy information, so you can take a look at that if you want. It's got my name in it, but that's it. And basically, I then design it. I then go through and put that, turn that into a spec. So this is, for example, some of the gift aid stuff. So this is a good example. This is dummy wording that I think I pulled from a different gift aid declaration form. And what the feature I'm actually building is allowing us to change this wording over time, just storing it as an array of just an array of strings, actually, and we then store those on the donation. So the organization, the charity, can set them, or they're set by default by us. And then every single sentence shows up as a separate tick box that the user has to tick to declare their gift aid eligibility. And that declaration is then transposed onto the donation. And what that does is it provides us a snapshot of the exact wording they consented to at that time, because if we change the gift aid wording in the future, we want to know every individual donation what gets consented to. At the moment, they are all stored as one date field, whereas and that's actually a hassle. So we basically have one tick that consents to all 3. We are separating those out, and we always show one tick for the whole paragraph, whereas it would be really handy just to have them. It's just a simple array of strings that they're going to loop over. And so this design doesn't actually, I don't use the designs to specify the wording or anything like that. A lot of those things change. I'm aware that as some organizations, like the way the UI design is done is fixed, and that's basically part of the spec. I work a lot more fluidly than that. Again, these little prompts and things by the buttons, they tend to get reworded. I tend to change things on the fly, but again, it's because I'm able to kind of decide what's in and what's out, especially as I work on it and kind of decide what I like and don't like as it goes live. And so I'll start with this process in Sketch, and then I use Notion a lot for speccing at the moment, and I haven't written this up yet, but this is what I'll be working on. So hopefully if I get this written up tonight, we can take a look at some of these tomorrow. And so this is an example of where the actual the new donation process, prepping for the eligibility for recurring donations and things like that. We use Notion to lay that out, and then we have a technical specs document. And I'll create just a few notes. Again, I've only started these, but I thought people might be interested just to see how we do things. And I have used Trello a lot in the past, so this idea of having an inline board worked pretty well for us. So I don't think any of these have actually got specs in. But you can see I kind of do and don't use this as the donor. I want to enter the required information for a gift aid claim so I can get past this step as quickly as possible and move on with my donation. So this comes back from a habit that I started a while ago, which was to use, the jobs to be done user story? Is that the name of that? It's something. Yeah, so as a something I want to sew that, and then there is a so this is, I tend to use a mixture of these two. So as a something I want to something, so that something, and then when something I want to, so I can something. Like that tends to be the two kind of mechanisms that I follow for those. And so I don't stick to them particularly rigidly, but if anyone kind of has a good system for working, because it's usually just me working on the coding, I usually know what I mean. But if I'm working with someone else, I tend to be a bit stricter on them. And then within there, I don't think I've written these up yet, but I'll then have a checklist. And because, again, it's usually me working with contractors, and they're usually developers, the checklist that I create for my specs tend to be basically the kind of wording I would use in the tests. So they tend to be the things I will be writing feature or integration specs on. So that kind of the thing the user would see, what they would click on, what they expect to happen next. That tends to be our format for them. So I'm always interested in seeing other people's. I'm aware they just tend to get more rigid as the team grows, and because I just work with contractors, I tend to be a bit looser, which is probably not great. But as long as there's something, we then go through them for QA with someone who's not a developer, and that tends to be a bigger source of friction, which is the way that these are worded, especially with the tick boxes and the bullet point lists and things like that. They tend to get you tend to need the person to have experience having read that format before for whoever's QAing them. So that tends to be where it bumps down. So that is how we approach multi-step forms and what I'm working on next. So it'll basically be implementing, you saw how simplistic that journey is at the moment, and it'll be implementing requesting the gift aid eligibility differently. At the moment we do it later on in the process. We want to pull it right up to the front. We want to implement this new multi checkbox per consent sentence, don't know what eligibility sentence, don't know what we're going to call them. We also want to, at the moment, we gather the user's postal address, no matter what. And we actually want to collect less information because there's new European payment regulations coming in, the SCA, which is, I can't remember what SCA stands for now, but it's part of PSD2, which again, I've forgotten what that stands for. But basically, we're going to need more information for the payment. So we want, at the moment, we collect the address up front. And what we want to do is get the gift aid consent, then collect the gift aid address if we need it. We then want to collect the billing address, which we will default to the gift aid address if we have it. And that will then help us try and get exemptions from the new SCA stuff for payments. So that's why this change is being made. We then want to, I think that's about it. I think it is those changes. So just it's mainly this information up front and being able to, when you get to the confirmation step, jump back and edit them and be able to make any changes that you want. And also we then need to show that information in the previous video, I was in Control Panel, which is the area we provide for charities and organizations to manage donations, fundraising pages, campaigns, whatever they're doing. So once the donor enters all this information, we have to make sure it ends up, if they have consented to provide their data for marketing purposes, or they have said that they are eligible for gift aid, then we have to make sure that that information ends up in Control Panel, and we have to write tests to make sure that if they haven't said don't add gift aid and don't share my data, that it shows up as not provided to the organization in Control Panel. So that's kind of the second half of it. So the first is gathering the data from the users in a better way, and the second half is showing it to the organizations in a better way. Okay, so that is what I'm going to work on. If people are interested, they can kind of take a look at a couple of other live streams. Hopefully if I get that spec finished this evening, I will chop it up into chunks and try and live stream working on them, and hopefully people will find that useful. But again, any feedback would really be useful from the last one. I know that last time I just kind of threw the live stream up without really thinking about it. This time I even wrote some notes. So thanks a lot, and have a great weekend.